Good evening, Lionel. Could you begin by telling us where and your full name and where and when you were born?
Yes, I don't remember where I was born, but I know when it was. My full name is Lionel Symonds, Symonds. For Lionel Louis, better have the other one, Lionel Louis Symonds, LL. And I was born on the 8th of March, 1905, at... You want the full address?
Oh, no, whereabouts you were
Doesn't
born?
really matter. Pardon?
Yes, which approximately.
Well, I know the address
Yes,
anyway.
let's
Yes,
have it.
my father had a retail shop, and he lived over it at the time when I was born. So I was in fact born over a retail shop in High Street, East Ham.
And so tell me something about your family circumstance when you were born.
Well, we're
Business?
part of a very small family. My father had three brothers and a sister, three brothers and a sister. My mother had two sisters, and I have just one sister. So we're not a large Victorian family by any stretch of imagination. And we only the family only lived over the shop for a very short time. I think I was about 8 or 9 when he left. It was during the war, during the First War, 1915. He rented a house in Wanstead.
Right, let's hold them up. So when you were born until you were 8 or 9, you lived over this shop. What sort of shop?
It was retail, men's tailoring and outfitting business. And my family were very caring, even for those days, because the shop had no material garden, and in order that my sister and I did have sort of fresh air and exercise, my parents employed I suppose for want of a better word, sort of a nursery governess who lived in and took us out for walks and educated us and told us which trees were which and what were the names of the flowers, and one was being educated without being aware of it.
Really? Did your mother help in the business?
Not at all, no. No.
What can you say about your parents? Your father, you said, was a businessman?
Well, the main thing about my father, tragically, was he died at the age of 44, which, of course, materially altered my whole life and outlook and everything about it, because...
How old were you then?
I was 17.
But going back, so you did have, you had 17 years of your
Oh yes, indeed.
father.
Yes.
Can you say a bit what sort of man was he that you knew him?
Well, of course, he was a very much a self-made man, but a very ambitious man as far as my sister and I were concerned. He was determined that we should have a better education than they had, and that was his attitude to life. He was a very enthusiastic Freemason, and he had a lot of Masonic friends who are... Well, you know a little bit about Freemasonry, no doubt. I don't know very much about it, in fact. But the point was that he had quite a cross circle of acquaintances, schoolmasters and so forth. And so he was able to consult these people about various aspects of my upbringing because they had this, that, or the other qualification.
Right. Where and when was your father born then? So
he was born in 1878. And I think the family at that time lived in Victoria Park Road. I think it was, I haven't been down there for many, many years, but I don't think it's much of a spot now. But at that time, I think it was the better class end of the East End Jewish families, you know. Victoria Park Road were nice houses in those days. And my mother's family, they were neighbours. That's how they got married. That's how it was. That's how it frequently was, of course, in those days. Because you see, there weren't the travel facilities, and there wasn't the ability to get around and know places. So you married the girl next door. That's how life was.
So I suppose what sort of orthodoxy were they regular?
Well, yes, my father was orthodox within the limits of running a business that was open on Saturday. So that it was very difficult. He belonged to the great synagogue in Duke's Place. And he didn't go very often. He couldn't go very often because Saturday was the busiest day of the week. But he always closed the shop on the High Holy Days, I remember, when I was only a kid then, of course. And we had a Jewish home. For better or for worse, we had kosher food and so forth. You know, I was never allowed to forget without it being rammed down my throat that I was a Jew. Unfortunately, I mean this quite sincerely, that the saddest thing that happened about regards religion, that during his lifetime he didn't come in contact with the liberal movement, because he was basically a liberal. He was always very annoyed at what went on, the lack of decorum. And I don't know if you've ever been to an Orthodox service, have you? It was terrible. He was always fulminating about it. But if only he'd met someone who was liberal, he was only wanted a little push and he'd have gone over. But mind you, he was only a man in his very early 40s. He was, you know, I call people in their early 40s boys now.
Right, and your mother, did she have any particular religious feeling? Or?
No, well, no, she went the same way. She was musical. She came from a musical family, and she was quite musical. As a matter of fact, I think I've got a medal around here somewhere. She got from the London School of Music or something. I mean, she was able to play the piano better than most people, you know. And her father was a successful businessman. He had a business. He was a shoe manufacturer. I don't know where. He died in 1911. I was only a child. I just about remember him. But as I say, my mother and father's families more or less grew up together, and they all knew each other, and all of them knew each other.
Your grandparents on your father's side, did you meet or know anything about
Oh yes,
them?
I did indeed. Yes, I knew them. I had contact. As a matter of fact, one of my uncles, one of my father's youngest brother, the one who was eventually the leading light in Campbell Symonds, he's dead now, of course, but he was an ambitious young man, and this would have been about 1910 or something like, before the First World War anyway. He went out to South America, to the Argentine, which was not common or garden in those days as it is now. It was a 6-week sea journey, I think. It wasn't round the corner. And he had, after he'd been there a year or two, this would have been about 1913, he had his parents come out to visit him and stay some time, and they did, and then they came back.
His parents, that's your grandparents?
My father's, my grandparents, usually, my father's parents, and my uncle's parents. And they, as I say, they went out there to visit him, and then they came home, and he wanted them to come out a second time, and the second time was in the early part of 1914, and you can imagine what happened. They couldn't get back, so they spent the whole of their war in Buenos Aires, in Montevideo, in either the Argentina or the Uruguay. So that I didn't see very much of my parents in those days, but my uncle.
Of your grandparents?
My grandparents, yeah, my grandparents. Yeah. But my uncle, the one who was instrumental in having them out, he was a successful businessman that way. He was a successful businessman with Campbell Symonds. He was no fool. But he was a very lonely man. That's why he had his parents out there to stay with him. He spoke fluent Spanish, but he couldn't somehow get friends. And I think it was the old story. There were no Jewish girls, and you couldn't marry if you wasn't a Jewish girl around. You know, full stop. That was the end of it. And he was very anxious to have someone from the family, and he tried very hard to get my parents to let me go out there, and he would educate me. But my mother said, over my dead body, as you can imagine, you see. So that was the end of that one. But anyway, eventually, he brought his parents back here after the war when everything settled, and his parents, that's my grandparents, resumed their normal life. And he went back, but having had his parents living with him for about, how many years, it was 5 years, he couldn't settle down, and he eventually threw it all up over there, and came over here and settled down there, and that was how Campbell Symonds was born. Because Campbell was a friend of his out there in South America. That's where they met, and they came over, and they lived in Wembley, and they said, what about having a go? And they had a go. None of them were in the motor trade, but that was what it was all about.
You told me your mother's father was in the boot business.
Yes,
I don't think you said your father's father.
Well, he wasn't very much. He was a terribly nice man, but he wasn't very much. He used to, I think he used to go sell food on the race course. He wasn't by modern standards a gentleman, but he was a delightful man, a lovely man.
But was that why you say your father was a self-made man? Did that mean he had your father
No.
didn't get much education?
No, he didn't. Well, they went to the Jewish free school. My brother, my father, and all his brothers, they all went to the Jewish free school. And that was the limit of their
But
education.
that means leaving school at what sort of age?
13 or 14, I suppose, in those days.
Yes.
So he was determined that I was going to do, and I went to a sort of minor public school. I don't suppose you've ever heard of it.
We start just a moment. We
Yeah.
started just completing your grandparents.
Yeah.
It sounds as if were all four grandparents born in this country.
Oh,
that
very
you-
much so, yeah. Yeah.
So
Oh, they were very, very English and proud of it, you know.
Do you know how far back your English?
Oh, yeah.
line
Well, I
goes?
don't know exactly. No, but all my grandparents were born here, and to the best of my knowledge and belief, but I can't be certain about this, their parents were as well. But I can't swear to that one.
And this would have been, they were all then sort of living in the East End of London area. as far
Well,
back as
more
you
or
know.
less, but not in the hoi polloi of the East End. I say Victoria Park Road, where they all lived in Victoria Park Road, because that's where my parents met. What was it was a sort of Golders Green of 1890. You know, it was an upper class area in those days. You see.
Right. Well, let's take then your background, and you don't know any further back what your great grandparents did.
No,
or
no,
anything
that
like
I don't.
No.
I do not.
Right.
No.
Taking your.
What I was going to say, one of the things I suffer from, of course, is that my father died so young that I was never able to sort of, when I became a teenager, an adult, I wasn't able to talk to him about all the things that one normally talks to one's father about.
Amazing, yes, what a pity.
Mm.
Yes. Well, what your schooling? You went to.
I went to
primary school?
Bancroft.
You went first to some local.
It was a
local
pub. Well,
primary school?
well. First of all, that's a funny story. First of all, again, you see, illustrating my father's feelings on the subject. I went to a Jewish boarding school in 1914, the beginning of 1914,
Whereabouts was that?
in Gravesend, Tivoli House School.
Not so uncommon. My father went somewhere similar in Kent. Yes, as a.
Perhaps the same one.
89. I don't think it was Gravesend, but.
It's the Tivoli House School, Gravesend. And anyway, when I'd been at the school, probably, and interestingly, the synagogue, Gravesend didn't have a synagogue, but the school had a synagogue, and that used to be regarded as the synagogue for Jewish people around who could come into services if they wanted to. So that I've always been brought up in I've never been able to or wanted to forget that I was a Jew.
The Jewish, I suppose the staff were all Jewish, presumably?
The staff that mattered were, yes.
How much tuition did you?
Well, I was very young, you see. I was only about 10. I mean, but anyway, that's what I was leading up to. I'd only been there to the school under a year, probably about 6 months. And the first of the air raids in
14.
Eh?
1914?
1915 it was, 1915. The very first of the air raids, and the school was bombed. And my mother came down like a boomerang. She bounced down there. I want my boy. And that was the end of my boarding school. But it was a blessing in disguise because the place was a complete phony. It was an absolute phony. I didn't realise until I went to a proper school how little education I was getting. We had fried fish on Friday nights and all that sort of thing, but that was about the limit of the education.
So you then went to which school?
Well, then I went to Bancroft at Woodford. But we lived at Wanstead at that time.
And Bancroft School is in Wanstead, is it?
Woodford.
Woodford.
The Drapers Company School.
I see. So that was, gave you a
I spent my whole of my education there, yeah.
decent schooling, was it?
Pardon?
That gave you a good...
Oh, that gave me a good back. The only thing is that because in those days, health, we didn't have antibiotics and swift cures in those days. I was a very weak, sickly sort of child. I had an awful lot of illness. Eventually it culminated in the operation for appendicitis, which today I would have had about, if I'd been under present circumstances, I would have had the operation about 3 years earlier than I did. I rumbled on with this grumbling appendix, and they finally decided they better take my appendix out, and then from that moment on I started to grow. It had held me back all my life up to that stage. And the other thing was that later on in life, apropos of illness and sickness, later on in life, comparatively recently, since I was married in fact, I had pneumonia, but the year before the sulfur drugs were invented, the M&B and that sort of thing, and there was no quick remedy. One was just had a crisis and you went up and up and up, and either went down for good or you got better.
But so that school was, because it was a day school, not.
Oh yeah,
boarding.
it was a day and boarding school, but I lived near enough for it to be I was day boy.
Were there many Jewish pupils?
The one family of about 3 brothers.
At all?
That was in an area which is now one of the most densely populated Jewish areas, but there were none in my day.
Why? So you moved to Woodford, you said, your father, when you were.
Well, we moved to Wanstead. You see, he wanted to get us away from living over the shop because it wasn't a good place, atmosphere for children, and he rented quite a biggish house, 5-bedroom house with a large garden, for £75 a year.
So that was nice.
Well, it was a very nice house indeed, yeah. And I went to school from here. I went to Bancroft and finished my education.
You said that wasn't then a Jewish neighbourhood?
No,
Where
not
did you
then.
go to synagogue?
Well, during his life, he belonged to the Great Synagogue in Duke's Place. But for convenience of my bar mitzvah, so that I didn't have to travel to the East End, he made an arrangement that I used to go to the Orthodox Synagogue in Forest Gate for tuition from the rabbi there, the minister. I don't think they called him rabbis in those days, whatever he was anyway. And I said my posher in the Great Synagogue in Duke's Place, which was quite a place.
But you didn't become you didn't worship regularly then in. Well, where did you?
I worshipped at until my father died. I worshipped with him, obviously, in the Great Synagogue, but not like all Orthodox families, only on high days and holidays. You know, there was no thought of going every Saturday. Well, we couldn't go every Saturday morning in those days because it was, business precluded it. But what I'm trying to stress is that although we always belonged, we were never allowed to forget that we were Jewish, in spite of the fact that we didn't go to synagogue every Saturday and the shop was open.
Did you say going to Duke's Place? You said your father had liberal tendencies, and presumably you travelled and you took public transport. Did you to get to Duke's Place?
Oh yes, we did. Yes. Well, now I'll tell you what he used to do. He was a very sincere man. He used to. We used to go up when we went up on the New Year. We just used to go up by train to Liverpool Street and come back again. But on the Day of Atonement, he used to go, and he used to take a room in the Great Eastern Hotel, so he didn't have to travel home. He was fasting, but he had a room in the hotel, so that he was, he was on the spot.
He'd walk a short distance to the.
So he could. It was just a short walking distance.
It was only he who did. Your mother.
Yeah, my mother did. Now, my mother hardly ever went. Women didn't go to synagogue, but of course, women were upstairs, weren't they?
So that was your religious life. By the way, you were an anglicised sort of long-standing English background. Presumably Yiddish wasn't spoken at all.
Not at all. No, not at all. No, we were very English, very English. And I must say, in retrospect, prejudiced about the Jews who were coming here from afar. Yeah, yes, definitely prejudiced about the Jews.
Why? Because they came here poor, presumably.
I don't think poor. I don't think it was poor. I think it was illogical completely. Have you ever heard the word Pollock?
Yeah. Yes.
Well, that's what we used to talk. We used to talk about the Pollocks. Pollocks were Jews who were not born here. But it was illogical. It wasn't logical. It was illogical.
Well, so it's all much prejudice, perhaps, but and you ship, weren't you, because you followed what you.
Yes. Well, the thing what you've got to bear in mind, I was too young to have an opinion of my own. You see, because I was only a child. I was only 17 when he died, in the early teens.
But did you see much of such immigrants then around the East End?
Well, there weren't any in East. There weren't any in the area we lived. Not any at all. There were no kosher shops. There was nothing. We used to go what we used to call down the lane, Middlesex Street, when we wanted anything special. Barnet, I don't suppose you know all those places, do you? Anyway, we used to go to Barnet's for meat, and there were 2 Barnets. There was one for smoked salmon, and there was another one for kosher meat. But I remember my parents, or my mother, I suppose, dealt with a kosher butcher locally in my early childhood, but my father got so appalled at their standards or lack of standards of cleanliness and hygiene that he read the Right Act, and that's why I'm saying he was waiting to be liberal.
Yeah.
You see?
But when you went to Petticoat Lane, you would see more of the immigrant type.
Well, I used to go shopping. I used to go on the bus. You see, and used to go on the bus from Wanstead and with a shopping list, and because there were one couldn't get anything locally. I mean, there was a shop in Hatch End now, but there was nothing like that. And one had to go into the East End to get anything.
To get anything of
a
a
Jewish nature, yeah. As simple as that.
Did you meet any anti-Semitism?
Well,
I suppose
dreadful.
when you were young.
When I was at school, I was very unlucky or lucky, whichever way you look at it. When I first went to the school, I wasn't aware of the word anti-Semitism didn't mean anything to me. And I remember, I tell you, there was only one Jewish family there, two brothers. I think the younger brother came along later, but so Jews were unknown in the area. And I was rather a simple child when I went to the school. Someone must have said to me, "Are you Jewish?" And I said, "Yes." And I got a terrible time. They used to, coming home in the train, they used to corner me and knock me about. I really suffered. I really suffered from anti-Semitism as a small child. Dreadful. But I was very lucky because very near to where I lived, so it was near enough that we used to travel to and from school, there was a boy about my own age, but a very, very bright, brilliantly clever young chap he turned out to be, who was very well liked. And the general attitude was that if it was all right for him, I must be all right, you see. We used to do everything together, and so the consensus of the school was that if Ronald Hyatt was friendly with me, they could be, you see. So that overcame, so later on I had no problem at all.
That improved things.
And I also belonged to the cadet corps, because it was during the war when I was at school, and I was an enthusiastic cadet, toy soldier.
Right. But your father died when you were still at school, was it?
Oh, I was 17, yeah.
17.
Yeah.
How did he died of illness, was it?
Well, he had a sudden infection that today he would have had a shot of penicillin, and that would have been that. It was, I don't know if you've ever heard, it's called encephalitis lethargica. A brain thing, isn't it? And since then, during my comparative recent years, after I was married, I had meningitis, and which is a very similar complaint. And when I was taken suddenly ill that day, I remember I said to the doctor, I was in a terrible state, but I was sufficiently cogent to be able to say to him that my father died of encephalitis lethargica, have I got the same? Because I hadn't. But the point was this, you see, that he had it and just died in about 4 days. I had meningitis, and I had a shot of penicillin or whatever it was, and a couple of days I was all right. Well, I mean, I wasn't well, but I mean, I was, I was alive.
So you suffered this tragic death, and how did that affect the family and your mother?
Well, it affected us terribly.
But what sort of business? The father, you said, had a shop. Was it only one shop?
No, he started off with one shop. He had 5 when he died.
So then he was quite a prosperous.
He had a car, which in those days wasn't very common. No, he was a successful businessman in a quiet way, but tragic, absolutely tragic. And the tragedy of it was that he was 44, and he had a partner, and he only had my sister and I, 2 children. His partner was a typical Jewish man who had a family of about 9 or 10, and they made identical wills. His partner was about 10 years older than my father, and they made identical wills, which was a logical thing to do, because by the law of averages, the partner should have died first, being the older man. But he didn't, so that we were in a very, very poor state indeed. I had a very, very tough time after he died.
What, you weren't left a fair share?
Well, we were left a fair share, but the point was that the man sort of, I won't say fiddled the figure, perhaps that's too strong a word, but the figures were manipulated in such a way that we got a very, very small income from the business. And after a few years, at the earliest possible time that he could wipe his hand, he ceased the income, and that was that.
Yes, so how did your mother...
Well, we lived a very quiet. You see, at that time I was working in the business. When my father died, I went into the business. You see.
What, you just left school? And
Well, yes, I was I hadn't really left. I was on the point of leaving, but because he died, my father was on the point of indenturing me to a firm in the West End where I was going to learn the trade properly. But all that went by the board, and so the partner, who was a very stupid man. Well, he wasn't very well disposed towards me, as a matter of fact. and he, that was what happened. You see. But anyway, what happened? I was in the business, and I say doing. I wasn't doing all right. I was just doing. That's all. But I finally got fed up. I couldn't see that I had any real prospects there. So I pulled out of what, in fact, was my birthright in a way, my father's business, because I couldn't see any future in it. And
so what did you?
well, I tell you what happened. I applied for one or two jobs, and I took one, and I went to see my uncles who were then in Campbell, got Campbell Symonds going, you see. And I went to see them and told them what I was going to do, and my uncle said, well, I don't think that's much of a job. I think it would be better if you came with us. I think we could find you something. I said, no, I want to be on my own. But in the meantime, between that day and the day I was starting with this firm, or this job that wasn't very good, I got a job with a top-class firm as a company rep, and stayed with them for quite a number of years. I was quite successful there, until eventually Campbell Symonds were expanding, and they were opening more branches, and they they wanted me. It was as simple as that. So I threw up my job with it was a Sanitors company I was with. They were a well-known public company. They were a very well-known company at that time, because they had been part of the Lever Group, and they were one of the few people who didn't like the way things were going as far as they were concerned, and they floated a company called the Sanitors Trust to buy themselves out of levers, which is a very unusual thing.
So you were a sales representative?
I had a sales representative, I had a territory, and I had I had a status, there's no question. After a short time I bought a car, and I remember I was had to be terribly careful in those days. I remember going to them and saying, could they lend me the money for a car, because I felt I could do so much more business with one, and I could get one for £40, and would they lend me the money, and I'll pay them back out of my weekly wages, sort of thing. So that was the beginning of my motoring, £40 for a car. But eventually, as I say, Campbell Symonds offered me a job, and my family thought, well, it was a logical thing to do. I don't think it was. I would never recommend anybody to work for family, in the light of my experience, because you see, your honesty tends to be taken for granted, because Johnny wouldn't rob his uncle, sort of thing. You see, on the one hand, and on the other side, the thing is that you're taken for granted because you're not in a competitive market. You see, you have to accept what they're willing to pay you, because you can't say to your uncle or whoever it is, look, this isn't good enough. If you don't give me more, I'll leave. I was a very unsatisfactory situation there, because that coloured my whole life.
Nevertheless, how long? So how old were you when you entered Campbell?
I went to Campbell Symonds. That was in. I was 31, and it was in 1936.
And where were you lived? Did you continue to live with your mother?
Yeah, I lived with my mother, and my sister got married, and so I was sort of the head of the house, if you know what I mean. I was running the home, and I lived with her until she died in 1947. And I married my wife, who I'd known for years, who was also placed in a very similar situation, where she had a widowed mother in exactly the same way. And anyway, we got married a year after my wife died, and after my mother died, I beg your pardon, and that was that. And we had 25 years happy married life, all but a matter of weeks. So we were arranging and had organised our silver wedding, and she died suddenly, just like that.
So yes, your wife's name was
Amstel. She was actually David Amstel, you see, how that's the family. That's how I got to know her, you see.
First name was, you said Amstel was the...
was a family name. She was
yes,
known,
her first name was...
Well, her proper name was Sarah, but she was known, everybody, since she was a child, she'd been known as Poppy, but her name was Sarah. Sarah Amstel was her proper name. Right. And David was her true nephew, you see. Her brother was David Amstel's father.
Right, David Amstel of the NPLS congregation, yes.
That's right, yeah.
Right. So, tell me now, when did you, going back to your Jewish affairs, when did you join the liberal movement?
After when I got married.
Right. And how did that come about?
Because in order to get married, you see, my wife's family has been connected with the liberal movement since it first started. My wife's parents used to go to meetings in Lily Montague's house to talk about starting the thing up right at the outset, you see. So and as I say, I was only waiting to be pushed. You know, I only wanted the urge, and so that's how it all happened.
Where were you married?
No, I wasn't. No,
you were married in which city? You were married in Senegal, presumably.
Yes, I was married to the Liberal in the LJF. Yeah, because they belonged there. My family belonged there. My wife's family belonged there, and I joined in order to get married.
And did you play some active part at the LJS?
No, I didn't. Not at all in those days, because my job was very demanding when I was fully occupied. So I didn't. We used to go to, of course, in those days, the latter part, we used to go to services fairly frequent. My wife was a very authentic Liberal. You know, she was born and bred Liberal. You know, her heart was Liberal, you see. And we used to go quite frequently on Saturday mornings, and not only the high holy days, but all the various, you know, bits and pieces.
Did you have any particular recollection of the ministers or?
Oh, indeed, yes, indeed. Oh, yes, absolutely. It was a because at that time Matic was still alive. He was a sort of waning influence. He was going out, you see, but he was still there, and his son-in-law was what was his name? Matic's son-in-law.
Edgar.
Edgar, yes, Leslie Edgar. Leslie Edgar was the principal minister, and there was another man called Cohen,
yes,
who was there, who I liked very much, as a matter of fact. But Leslie Edgar married us, you see.
So you stayed, and where were you living in this period?
I was living in Ealing at that time. Yes, I was living in Ealing at that time. Well, what actually happened, I had the house in Ealing, and when my mother died, I didn't want the responsibility of running the house, so I let the house furnished and went in to live in a hotel temporarily so that I could sort of get myself sorted out. I got myself sorted out to the extent that I got married, and so that was it.
So you were in Ealing until your wife?
I lived in Ealing until we came over. No, my wife died in Hatch End, actually, over here. Right. We moved, you see.
What caused you to move to Hatch End?
I was too near the business. The garage business is a 7-day-a-week business, and I lived literally within sight of it, just across the road. So, and everybody knew I lived there, and if something could go wrong with their car on Sunday afternoon or Saturday morning or any time, you see, and I was getting fed up with being so near, you see. People, the chap, one of the staff was, so I lived literally across the road, within sight of the place. So they came, oh, Mr. So-and-so, he's like, can you have a word with him?
So why did you choose Hatch End?
We were just house hunting and looking around, no particular reason. It just happened to be it was a house. We lived, funnily enough, round the corner here in Anselm Road. I bought 37 Anselm Road was the house that I bought at the time for a massive amount of £6,000. Everybody thought I was crazy to pay £6,000 for that.
When was that?
And then when was that? Isn't it terrible to have a memory like this? I'm getting so old and so stupid.
Your wife died when?
47.
How many years did you live here then?
Well, it was about 5 years before that, I suppose. Yeah.
During the war, yes. Did the war? What happened? Did the war have the Second War have much effect on you?
Well, I didn't serve. I didn't serve in anything because I was in a reserved garage business was a reserved occupation. You see, because most garages were doing war work. You had to do something. If you had a lathe, you had to make something with it. You know. So that I was in a reserved occupation as far as that went.
Did you serve as an air raid warden?
Oh, I was an air raid warden. Yes. Oh, yes. Very much so. Very much so. That was in Ealing, of course.
So you were here, and then tragically your wife
died. Yeah.
And how did that affect you then?
Well, I suppose I was shattered really, but a very extraordinary thing happened. You know that my mother always used to have a corny expression that turned out to be very true about God's high and looks low. One gets these terrible things that happen, and when my wife died, you know, it was sort of the end of everything. But I'm trying to think what it was that enabled me to hold on. Something happened. Oh, I know what it was. Campbell Symonds was sold, and a new man came along, and I was so involved with this takeover and so forth, and it was a long story which I won't bore you with. That I was so involved because I hadn't got time to think about my own problems.
Mm.
It was as simple as that.
Then you became, though, more involved. So how long did you stay active in the business? You retired when, or was the business you?
Well, see, when I didn't retire in the full sense of it, I just sort of drifted out, you know.
Gradually, is
Where are we now? What,
1988.
1988. I'm trying to think what happened, how I pulled out. Yes, I suppose it was about 5 years ago, not much more, that I finally gave up.
Okay, and you were doing an office?
Yeah. Well, I was administrative really. It wasn't office work, but I mean I was running the show. Sort of general managing.
Of the what?
Of the garage.
Sales and.
The whole thing. I was responsible for the whole thing.
Yeah.
I wasn't a mechanic. I mean I didn't work with my hands, but when you're in the business for 30 or 40 years, you get to know your way around, and you know I used to run the thing. But my only talent that I'm not a talented person at all, but one talent I did have, and I haven't got now, was organisation. I was always a good organiser.
Yes.
So that's all you need to be managing a business.
Now you became involved though in administration of the LGS St John's Wood, didn't you?
Oh well, I took it. No, I tell you I tell you how that happened. They advertised in the monthly, weekly Wales thing that they wanted a retired. It was just about the time I was retiring. You see, they wanted a retired businessman to assist the secretary, and I applied for this job. And by a strange coincidence, a year or two before, when we were on holiday in Switzerland on one occasion, we met Lazarus. What's his name? You know, to somebody Lazarus here now.
Yes, Peter Lazarus.
We met Peter Lazarus and his wife. We happened to be staying in the same. We didn't know each other. We happened to be staying in the same hotel in Switzerland. And so when I went for the job, Peter Lazarus was at that time the chairman of the synagogue, and so that was it. I got the job.
And you were helping on the covenants?
I was assistant secretary at that time because the man I was appointed, they wanted the secretary was unwell, they thought, and they wanted someone to assist him to make his life a bit easier. But the poor chap was dying of cancer, and about a fortnight after I got there, he died. So that I was lumbered with the job of being the secretary of the Liberal Jewish synagogue when I knew precisely nothing about it. That was a year.
But this wasn't 5 years ago?
Oh no, more than 5 years ago. No. This was in. Considerably more than 5 years ago. I'm trying to think what. Are you going on my previous note?
I can't see that. Well, it was quite a few years ago, and you were living. Yes, you were still here in.
I was living in Hatchend, yes. Yeah.
Well, when did you join the Northwood and Pinner congregation?
We joined it. We joined it right at the outset. We went to the very first meetings they were held to talk about whether they should have one. They had a dinner at the restaurant in by the golf course. You weren't around there, were you? Anyway, we went to that meeting and we joined in any case. And we knew quite a number of the people there because, well, I'd say majority of them were LJS people, you see, so we knew them. And then the business was sold and things went wrong as far as I was concerned financially, and we decided that it was stupid to belong to two synagogues with two lots of subscription and so forth. So I pulled out. In fact, I think I've still got the letter when I resigned, and so I pulled out of Northwood and Pinner. But at this moment of time, I'm still a member of both.
You pulled out of St John's Wood?
No, I haven't. No, I've never pulled out of St John's Wood. I pulled out of Northwood and Pinner for a period because we thought that my wife had a very emotional attachment to the LJS because she'd been there since she was a child, and she couldn't contribute. She didn't dislike Northwood and Pinner, but it wasn't home to her like the LJS was. But after she died, of course. But I still kept up my membership. I'm still a member. Well, as I was working there, I thought the least I could do was to. And the only reason I stopped working there, I was doing covenants and whatnot, was because the synagogue was closed and they were moving to. And I thought, well, this is the right moment to make a break. And they're moving, you see. They're employing somebody else.
And what did you find yourself doing at Northwood and Pinner? I recall, in fact, you became an administrator for the religion school.
Well, I did. I used to work beyond that, didn't I?
Several years.
Yeah.
Which you presumably.
I think we did much more.
Doing that?
Yes. Oh, yes. That went on for quite a few years. But I haven't done very much at Northwood and Pinner, other than that. Because it's a very nice, warm relationship at Northwood and Pinner with the Goldsmiths. It's so different to any other synagogue, isn't it? They're all part. One feels part of a family.
Yes. Right. And I think that's covered the main things. Oh, your name. Just confirming the names. Your family name Symonds. What was the original form of that name, as far as you know?
It's always the same. When I was born. I don't know of anything else.
Your grandparents, it was the same form. Yes. Right.
I think the origins. I think I once heard from one of my uncles it was a Dutch. There was a Dutch connotation somewhere, but I have no real knowledge of that.
Right. Is there anything else, perhaps, particularly about any Jewish aspects of your life or your family that you might think worth mentioning?
Not really, I think. I can't think of anything worthy of interest that worth recording.
Oh, you might just confirm, your sister was what, older or younger than you?
3 years younger than I, yeah.
And what was her name? What's her name?
Her first name was Stella, and she married a man named Phillips. And he's slightly younger than I am, but he's gone to pieces. I don't know how bad. But he's taken an intense dislike to me. I think he's a little bit of a nutcase, really. Okay. So for the sake of having peace in the family, my niece, that's my sister's daughter, said it'd be better if you kept away. And this is a very sad thing for me. But anyway, that's it. As a matter of fact, their son, that's my great nephew, is coming to have lunch with me on Sunday. I do have a contact. And the other thing which was rather interesting, that my wife's family have Dutch connections because an uncle of hers, or was it an aunt? No, it was an aunt of hers, married a Dutchman many years ago, and that family has grown up, and I still have contact with them. With about the third generation, the boy, he's a man of 40-something, he's the same age as David. He used to come and stay with us from Holland, and so we grew up with a very happy relationship. But not Jewish at all. They've got no Jewish contact there. You know, I don't know if you know that in Holland, the Jews, many of the Jews had suffered so badly during the Holocaust that they vowed they would have nothing to do with Judaism afterwards. So much so that one of the children, who was born in 1946 or 47, they wouldn't even have him circumcised.
Well, sad but understandable.
Yes. Terrible, doesn't it, when you think of it?
Yeah. You previously lent me some photographs which I copied. We might just confirm who is who. This one on the left.
That's my wife's parents.
Right.
That's my wife's father, who was a schoolmaster. That's my mother.
Mother, right. And
her maiden name was Prager. Her maiden name was Prager.
Oh, your
my mother.
Yes, Prager.
Yeah.
Spelled
Preager.
In fact, you haven't actually said your parents' first names were. What were they?
Hannah she was Hannah Prager before she married.
Your father's first name?
Well, his name, which he never ever used, but it was his name, was Moses. But I don't think he enthused about being called Moses, so he was always known as Robert.
Okay, and I think that's the same photos, yes. And this just happened to be a photograph of Monty.
Oh, Monty, yes. Well, that was because my wife was working for Roots at that time. You see, during the war, she had a quite a good job. Yes, I've got this photograph, the original of it somewhere. Yes, that's what it was. That was my wife's wartime job. She worked for Roots.
And had contact with.
Well, I think she was a private secretary to one of Sir William Roots, I think, or one of them, and that's how she was in on the act, you know. Reginald Roots, the younger brother.
Well, thank you. Unless you have any final thoughts on your philosophy of life or anything final of that nature.
That my philosophy of life, that I was brought up in a completely non-Jewish atmosphere, as I can tell you, because there were no Jewish people, there were no Jewish shops, there was nothing. But I was never allowed to forget I was a Jew, and I'm still the same today. I mean,
Original, yes.
It's one's instinct more than anything else, isn't it? That's right. As a matter of fact, it's rather strange how one becomes associated with a religious background. I become very friendly towards, or they become very friendly towards me, with Sidney Brickstow's boys. Do you know his family?
Yes.
And I don't know if he married, his wife was killed in a car crash. Did you know about? And anyway, he's got a son and daughter by his first marriage, and boys by the second marriage. Well, I don't know how, I can't tell you how it started, but I became friendly with, or he became friendly with me with Daniel, who was the son by the first marriage, and he had a mental breakdown about a year or two ago. Do you know that?
Thank you.
Did I tell you?
I think I heard.